So even though Matthew lived at the right time and says he knew Jesus, they would argue that, hey, some people would argue that he doesn't count as a witness or he doesn't count as a true historian. But I would just ask you this. If we're looking for a historian in history who wrote about Jesus' life, a historian who said Jesus lived and throughout his life performed miracles and claimed he was God, and then he got crucified for his beliefs, and then 3 days later he rose from the dead and he appeared to all these people. If you're looking for a historian who would document those things but not be a Christian, what kind of person are you really looking for? I mean, who would you really be describing? Who would really believe all those things about Jesus but not be a Christian?
Well, I don't think that you necessarily have to believe all of those things in order to report that that's what Christians believe, which is exactly what we find in later historians talking about what Christians believe. These non-Christian sources that are so regularly touted by historicists, they didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God and he resurrected and all that, but they did report what the Christians believe. A good example of this would be Pliny the Younger. He reported what the Christians believe, more specifically when they practiced their holy ceremonies and shit. We also don't need the author of this historical reference that we're postulating here to be a non-Christian. They could totally be a Christian. Just like with Paul, we get a lot of good historical information from Paul, but it's just not historical information that leans in your favor of historicity. All of the information in Paul actually leans away from historicity or is neutral on the historical claim. So the fact that we regularly use Paul in order to establish certain facts about Christianity and what Christians believe in the first century seems to indicate that we don't need specifically non-Christians to reference Jesus. But also, in order to establish that Jesus existed, all you need is just a mere reference to Jesus actually existing. That doesn't entail stating that this Jesus actually died, resurrected, and absolved sins and all this other stuff. They don't need to say all of that extra shit, just that there was this fucker named Jesus, he did some magical tricks and convinced a bunch of people, and then he got fucked over by the Romans. Like, that's what we would need, but every single reference that even comes close to that is an interpolation that was put in these historical works by later Christians.
In fact, many of the people who end up becoming Christians in the early Christian church are people who were skeptical at first, but because of the things they saw in Jesus' life, became Christians. And then after they're Christians, start producing Christian literature, writing the teachings of Jesus, the story of Jesus, different religious principles that Jesus would have wanted people to follow. That's how they become the Christian. And so I don't know if we're looking for, we can't believe Jesus is a historical person unless a Roman guy says that Jesus lived and performed miracles and died and rose from the dead. I mean, I'm just not. Yeah, we're probably asking for too much from the historical record.
Well, no, because that's not what mythicists want out of the historical record. You're totally misrepresenting what would clearly be needed to establish that Jesus was historical. Because we don't need all of that extra shit. Everything after Jesus walked the earth or Jesus existed in history, we just simply don't need. All we need is a reference to some Jewish fuck named Jesus that gathered a following prior to the 30s AD. Like, that's what we would need, but yet we don't find that, not even in Paul.
I don't think it's reasonable to think that nobody existed, that Jesus didn't exist, and all of Christianity sprung up from nothing. I think that goes beyond a reasonable explanation. I think truly when we look at what happened in history, that all of a sudden there's this religion that springs up, and that all the followers, those early followers, are saying that they knew this guy personally, and they're willing to even die for their belief that this guy really lived and that they really knew him. I think the most reasonable thing to believe is, yeah, Jesus was a real person. He must have lived because you can see the tremendous impact he had on the lives of the people who were in his life.
Well, no, none of that is actually true. Plus, mythicists do not say that he was completely made up out of thin air. He was established using an understanding of the Jewish lore that it already existed. This Messiah figure that was coming to absolve the Jewish people through a shameful death and resurrection was already expected by the Jews. So it's only a slight shift from expecting it to, oh shit, it happened, in order for Christianity to come about. The early Jewish Christians that existed, they didn't just pop out of thin air, out of whole cloth, like you seem to think that they do, because your hypothesis entails that this Jesus figure existed and that there was no understanding prior to this point that this Jesus figure was supposed to come, and then all of a sudden he appears and Christians are created. Whereas my hypothesis, the minimal mythicist hypothesis, is much more parsimonious. That the idea of this suffering and dying Messiah who was to be put to a shameful death that would eventually absolve our sins was to come around the 30s AD. And when the 30s AD got there, they assumed that he came, that it all happened in the celestial realm, just like in other cults at the time. Considering the fact that in Jewish lore, the firmament, the lower heavens, was a physical place where physical things existed, it's very easy to see how it eventually transformed from this celestial plane, which was physical, to the more earthly plane down here over the course of about 40 years. We see this in other modern cults that we can actually look at for case studies, like the Luddites, like the cargo cults, and like the Roswell incident, provoking a number of UFO experiences and a whole subculture of UFO enthusiasts. All of these things developed in a matter of decades, just like what happened with Christianity.